It's a tremendous pleasure to see the 2012 G.K. Gilbert Award presented to Rudy Slingerland of Penn State University. Rudy has served our community for over 3 decades, and he's done so through his own science, through inspiring science in students, postdocs, and colleagues, and through serving our organizations like NSED, like the Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System, CSDMS, where he has just finished a 5-year term as the inaugural chair of the steering committee. Now, in terms of Rudy's research, the range of topics that have attracted his interest is truly remarkable. And so it is that among sedimentary geologists and stratigraphers, Rudy is known, among other things, as one of the founders of quantitative dynamic stratigraphy, one of the practitioners and champions as well. On the other hand, if you talk to a paleoceanographer, they'll tell you about Rudy's pioneering work in reconstructing ancient circulation patterns in ancient oceans using computational fluid dynamics. Tectonophysicists will know him best through his work on fold and thrust belts, ancient and modern, and their foreland basins, whereas geomorphologists tend to be most attuned to his work in landscape evolution and river dynamics. And it's notable, for example, that his work in modeling river-long profile evolution, which he started with Scott Snow in the late 80s, in many ways helped give rise to the surge of interest in that topic that we enjoy today. So across that diverse body of work, there's one thread that I think runs consistently through it, and that is an absolute insistence on approaching science through questions that are very carefully phrased and very precisely worded so that they cut to the heart of the matter. So G.K. Gilbert himself had a similar penchant for seeing through the complexity, the noise, the richness of the natural world to discern the underlying core principles at work. And so it seems fitting then that the Rudy should be the recipient of an award that's named in Gilbert's honor.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Greg, for those kind words. Thanks to the Surface Processes Focus Group here at AGU. And thanks to all my students and colleagues. This is as much your honor as mine. It's a marvelous time to be studying morphodynamics of planetary surfaces. We have these unprecedented data sets, and we now have models that we can use to try to interpret them. And in my experience over 30-some years, there's been an amazing renaissance in this field of geomorphology, sed-strat, surface processes, in large part due to all of you out there. And I'm really pleased to be a part of it. Thank you.
So as you know, the Gilbert Award is sort of our crowning award, but we try to also recognize those people that are just starting out in our climb up the ladder of success, if you will, and try to honor people that are in their early mid-career with the Luna Leopold Award. And this year's Luna Leopold Award goes to Mike Lamb, who also, as you know, is going to be the Sharp Lecturer. To present the award, we've asked David Morrig to say a few words, and then we'll let Mike answer that, and then essentially progress on to your lecture, Mike. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to introduce Mike Lamb as the 2012 recipient of the Luna B. Leopold Young Scientist Award. Mike's work is really characterized by diversity, a diversity of topics and a diversity of processes and methods that he uses to solve those. He looks at upland landscapes, at coastal landscapes, marine settings, and then finds time to work on other planetary bodies like Mars and Titan. And when he does this work, he takes advantage of targeted field campaigns. He looks at experimental work in a very precise and clarifying way, and then also uses focused theoretical analyses to really get at the heart of the questions that he's asking. As a result of this, he has made fundamental contributions actually since he published his first authored papers while still an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota and working at St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. He has looked at the formation and the maintenance of bedrock canyons and channels. He has addressed a variety of important sediment transport mechanisms, and not only the modern process, but then he's taken his understanding of sediment transport and applied it to things like extreme events on other planets like Mars and Titan and the snowball Earth. And he has made some really important contributions by showing that if you're going to get coastal river systems right, you have to explicitly connect them to their downstream boundary condition, which is and beyond, which is the marine. So he's been able to look at changes between normal flow and backwater flow and the way that the water accelerates to the coast during floods by actually putting in the jet that develops in the marine environment. Without that, he would have been stuck. And he has also been able to show that when studying the affluent of rivers and what may or may not occur as a hyperpycnal flow, that if you don't put in the configuration of the basin, the chances of getting an accurate representation of whether these events happen or not will be missed. So he has helped and led a variety of important scientific topics in our field, and we're thankful and looking forward to see what he does during the rest of his career. But I want to make one other point here, which has to do with Mike's website. Those of you that know Mike and have perused his website will see up in the upper right-hand corner a little toggle for Owen P. Lamb, who is his grandfather and also was a fluid mechanician and an engineer who preceded Mike in working at St. Anthony Falls Lab. Mike is proud of his grandfather's accomplishments, and I'm sure that his grandfather would be equally proud of what Mike has done. And it is really because of the diversity in Mike's work and its excellence that he is carrying on really a central characteristic of Luna's career. And as a result, he really is an excellent and ideal candidate to be awarded this Luna Leopold Young Scientist Award.
You don't get an award without a piece of paper, so here is your certificate to proudly hang on your wall or whatever you want to do.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you for this award. It's really my pleasure to be a part of this community. The science I really enjoy, and partly what makes it so enjoyable is interacting with a number of you. In my short career, the early mid-career award or the mid-early career award? I'll go with the mid-early career award. In my short career, I did look at my website this morning and I counted 102 co-authors that I've had the pleasure to work with on papers, and it's really been a collaborative effort. I have no sole-authored publications, which is not by design, but just happens because it's so fun to interact with all of you on different projects. I wanted to mention a couple of people because my list isn't as long as Rudy's. I've been fortunate to work with a number of mentors over the years, and Chris Paola is the one who really inspired me to first go into this field. Gary Parker gave me my first project. Jeff Parsons was my master's advisor at University of Washington. Bill Dietrich, my PhD advisor, significantly shaped my goals. David, I worked with as a postdoc, and both Alan Howard and Paul Myro have been sort of cosmic advisors of sorts. In 4 years at Caltech, I've had a pleasure to work with Ryan Ewing, Ben Mackey, Pyro Chantantavet, Roman DiBiase, Adam Booth, Vamsi Ganti, and Edwin Kite as postdocs, and Ajay LeMay, Joel Scheingross, Jeff Prancevic, and Matthew Lapote as graduate students. And now I won't have to repeat their names when they come up on the slides, because most of the things I'll talk about in the Sharp lecture are also collaborative and as a result of interactions with these people. So thank you.
Well, we link the Sharp lecture with our awards, and after we have determined who win the awards, then we decide which of those two, the Gilbert or the Leopold Award, will present the Sharp lecture. And for the Xth year in a row, it's the Early Career Award winner who's going to give us the Sharp lecture. That means yet another piece of paper for Mike to hang on his wall. All right. So I introduce. Here's Mike.
Let's see. Is there a pointer, Alan?
I don't know. I use the system. I presume there must be.
Oh, here it is. Okay, so I can barely see that at this angle, so I'll look at this screen. I asked Alan how long I had to speak, and he said, 55 minutes, less than an hour, and then I get up here and the timer says 47 minutes, so I think... Oh, we won't turn it on, okay. So we may go 5 minutes over, so... I'm going to talk to you, as the title says, from bedrock slopes to deltas, new insights into landscape mechanics, so I'm going to talk about a range of different environments, including steep bedrock landscapes and going down to lowland environments, and therefore give you some of the latest results we've done in these different environments across this sort of source to sink transition. Before I do, I've already read off the names, but there's a number of people who have contributed to this talk, and in particular, students and postdocs at Caltech, Jeff, Pyrote, and Roman contributed significantly to what I'll show today, and funding sources here that I gratefully acknowledge, with much of the support coming from NSF. So I was wondering what I'm supposed to talk about in this lecture, and Rudy came up to me right before and he said, "I can't wait to hear your grand vision," which sort of gave me a little bit of butterflies in the stomach. And Alan also said, "What is your vision?" And this is something that's kind of hard to put together, but I gave it some thought. But first I decided I better look to my mentors to see what their visions might have been, to get some advice and support. And so I went on the web, and there's not a lot of vision statements actually on the web from my mentors, but there is one. So Gary Parker says, "It's my envision to empower my cats with world-class ability to think in rather than out of the box and without cutting themselves on the edge," with some illustrations here. And so I decided I better look further. And I wound up reading some literature from Luna and Bob Sharp where they've talked about their philosophies of science, and I have two quotes here. Luna says, "The most engaging, interesting intellectual work on geomorphic forms, such as river channels, has not come from computer specialists and theoretical models, but from field observations and measurements." And Bob Sharp says, in the lower corner, that the geomorphologist pursues his science by assiduously watching nature perform her everyday geological chores. From these observations, he's able to interpret the landforms constituting our present landscape. And I full-heartedly agree that there is some of the most interesting work that comes out of our community is from observing modern processes. But as I thought about this, I struggled to think whether one could put together the whole story from just observing modern processes, and I think it's difficult. And one of the reasons I think it's difficult is because the processes that we work on operate across such a wide swath of time and length scales. And here I just put up turbulence, grains, channels, deltas, Himalayas, just to give a sense of some 15 orders of magnitude in length and time scales of different processes that people work on in this room. And one of the things I think that makes Earth's surface dynamics really fun and interesting is that we have an opportunity and a reason to work across these scales, and that these different processes interact across the scales. And so there's things about turbulence that can tell us about mountain building. And that connection really makes the field rich and fun, but also challenging. And so if I have a vision, and the way I've been thinking about problems is this, that I think some of the most interesting insight to gain is to try to connect active process dynamics that we can measure in human timescales, like Jeff Nitrauer surveying suspended sediment in the Mississippi River here, or Roman DiBiase digging a hole on a hillside, which he does very well, to landscape kinematics, where we're getting increasingly more important tools, such as high-resolution LiDAR shown in the back, or Ben Mackey chipping away rocks for cosmogenic dating. But I make this distinction between dynamics and kinematics because we all know that the landscape evolves in a very dynamic way, but we get to see a snapshot of this when we go out into the field. And the tools that we have allow us to piece together ages and rates, if we're lucky, and geometries, but often not observe the dynamics play out. In modern processes, we can measure dynamical systems, but there is a disconnect often between these larger scale phenomenon. And so I think a lot of the interesting work to be done is bridging these sort of field efforts. And one of the ways to do this, I think, is through physical and numerical modeling. So physical and numerical modeling allows us to simulate rare or extreme events. It allows us to isolate variables that can be very difficult to do by observing modern processes directly, and also speed the pace of landscape dynamics so we can see the landscape dynamics unfold, at least our representation of them in models. Now, this isn't to say that I think fieldwork isn't important. It still is probably the most important, but I think that these extra tools allow us to bridge some of these gaps. So exciting opportunities exist to bridge these gaps and develop and test new theories at the frontier of our knowledge. And ultimately, this is the goal that I'm working on and that most of us are working on, I believe, and include informing theory with observations of modern dynamics, landscape kinematics, as well as bringing in experiments and models where appropriate. And again, this really makes it exciting that we have laid out in front of us landscape dynamics that we still don't have good theories for. And I think that's really exciting to be able to develop this new knowledge. So with that in mind, I'm going to start talking about some specific work that we've been doing recently that attempts to bring together multiple tools to address landscape dynamics across different scales. And the way I'm going to structure this presentation is really there's quite a lot of work that's been done, and we know quite a bit about soil-mantled landscapes and alluvial rivers. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to take knowledge that we know from these environments and push that knowledge into other environments and see how it holds up. And so we're going to push ideas from soil-mantled landscapes and alluvial rivers into very steep channels and hill slopes on one end, and then later in the talk we're going to push it to very low slopes with the interaction with the ocean. So this is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. Is first bedrock hill slopes, sediment storage and release by wildfire, moving into steep mountain channels, and particularly we're going to look at initiation of sediment transport by rivers and the transition to debris flows. And finally, we'll skip all the way down to the shoreline and talk about coastal river dynamics, backwater, erosion, and delta size. And I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and I'm just going to sort of give you some highlights of results to go through these environments. Oh, so warning, this talk is not as advertised, so here's my plug for Friday, because if you read my abstract for this talk, which you probably didn't, but if you did, you were probably very much excited to hear about bedrock canyon erosion, which I wasn't able to fit into this talk, but I will have an opportunity to talk about it on Friday. So going on to bedrock hill slopes. So, of course, there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done on soil-mantled hill slopes that have drastically increased our understanding of how they work in the past decade or two, including soil production, soil transport, and the evolution of topography. I'm going to focus in on the sediment flux problem. And in soil-mantled landscapes, this model of sediment flux scaling with the slope of the hill slope in a nonlinear way seems to hold very nicely in many landscapes. So here we see that the sediment flux increases with slope until we get to a critical slope where the sediment flux gets quite large. And in these landscapes, because we're going to talk about fire too, we'll just introduce that typically we know that when there's a fire, the sediment flux often increases off of these hill slopes. And this can occur because, for example, due to loss of root strength that can lead to enhanced landsliding or the development of rills. And importantly, when there is enhanced sediment flux off of soil-mantled hill slopes following fire, it's typically in response to rainfall, including both of these mechanisms. What we don't know is what controls soil transport in bedrock landscapes. Here's LIDAR, an image overlaid on LIDAR of the San Gabriel Mountains, which will be a test bed for many of the things I'll talk about because it's 3 miles away from my house. And the slope here, everything that's red is a slope greater than 45 degrees. So there's a significant amount of this, significant proportion of this terrain that is steep, and steeper than the angle of repose of loose sediment, which arguably is a good threshold slope for this slope-dependent model that I just put up. So we're in an environment where we would predict sediment fluxes should be infinite, for example, according to what soil-mantled landscapes have taught us. Now, we know that sediment flux isn't infinite, so instead this may indicate that there should be a lot of bare bedrock slopes, because we could be in an environment where sediment flux drastically outpaces soil production. Hill slopes should be stripped of soil. But this also doesn't seem to hold so much. Bare bedrock slopes are rare. Despite that, these slopes are so steep. And coming back to the fire problem, here we see that fire-induced sediment yield often occurs by dry processes, immediately following fire and without precipitation. And so I'm going to dig into some of these for bedrock slopes. And I emphasize we need models for fire-induced sediment flux in these landscapes because there's often a very strong connection between fires and debris flows that can lead to hazards. And for example, in the San Gabriel Mountains, after fires, before it rains, we see these channels are often loaded with dry gravel as this material just sloughs down the hill slopes. And then somehow, some way, when it rains, this leads to debris flows often that can be quite catastrophic. So the hypothesis that we're going to work with is that sediment is trapped by vegetation on steep slopes, and it's released after wildfire. And the idea is that these slopes are otherwise greater than the angle of repose, so sediment would be gravitationally unstable on the slopes if there weren't plants there. And the plants just simply act as dams that trap material upslope. As you can see here, this wedge of material trapped behind yucca. And this isn't a new hypothesis. It's been around for quite some time. And here's a cartoon, for example, from a review that is after Florsheim, showing sediment piles trapped behind vegetation. They burn and this sediment sloughs into the channel. But what hasn't been done before is to put this into a quantitative sort of mass balance framework and analyze how important it is. So we're going to dig into this idea with a model formulation, field measurements, lab measurements, and application to the San Gabriel Mountains. So the model is quite simple. It says that this is the sediment yield, Q, that's coming off of a base of a hill slope, and it says it should be proportional to the soil production rate, which is E, times the area of the landscape, A, or the area of the hill slope, times some fraction, psi, of the sediment that's being trapped by the plants versus that's not being trapped by the plants. And this would be the case for underfilled storage, meaning that the plants are actively trapping soil as it's being produced. We can contrast this to this conceptual case of filled storage, which would be the case where the sediment piles are at their maximum capacity. The vegetation can no longer trap any more sediment. And so in this case, the sediment flux coming off the base of a hill slope is just proportional to the soil production rate times the area. But we have this additional term here, which is the time-dependent change in the storage capacity. So we can trap more sediment by increasing the trapping capacity, for example, if plants grow bigger, or we can have a sudden pulse of sediment flux at the base of the hill slope if we remove the trapping capacity, for example, by burning sediment. So it's just mass balance in this framework. So this trapping capacity turns out to be a very important part of this conceptualization, and so it's something that we wanted to measure. So we went out into the hill slopes. We went to slopes that are otherwise greater than the angle of repose, where we see these well-defined wedges of material that are trapped behind plants, and we dug them up and measured how much is there. And here's Roman digging away. And we did this on hill slopes that hadn't been burned for some time, as well as hill slopes that had recently been burned. Often, if the burn is severe enough, all the plants are removed, but if it's not severe, there can be parts of plants that are remaining after fires, and in cases like that, we can see degraded sediment piles, for example, with this yucca, where the yucca arms have burned off, but the stalk has remained, and that's resulted in a reduced pile behind the yucca. And I'm just going to skip right to the results. We see that the measured volume trapped behind plants scales with the effective width, the basal width of the plant, and following a cubic dependence, so volume is proportional to the cube of this width. And this makes sense if these basically shows that these piles are following a pyramidal wedge sort of geometry, gives you the cube. We also show here, so this is for a number of different species, the different symbols, and the red are for post-fire. And you can see the dramatic reduction in the volume that's trapped for plants that remain on burn slopes by about a factor of 6. We also took this into the laboratory. Why the laboratory? Well, here we can isolate variables such as grain size, slope, width of the vegetation, and roughness in a way that's difficult to do in the field. And these experiments, again, are very simple. There's a tilt table. We have a plant here with a width, and it blocks material upslope. Again, the board is always steeper than the angle of repose, so without the blocker here, the sediment would simply roll off the board. And we look at the maximum amount of sediment that we can trap, and here's a side view picture and a plan view picture. And I'm not going to go through all the variables that we've gone through, but just to highlight a couple of the results. One is, here's the measured volume versus the modeled pile volume following this dominant cubic dependence. And you can see that the lab data, which are all the black symbols, line up nicely with the field data for the unburned case, because we're looking at the maximum capacity over several orders of magnitude in volume here. And you can also see that the burned measurements from the field fall systematically below this line, as you'd expect from loss of sediment. One of the more interesting trends that we found is once we normalize out this basal width cube effect, so on this plot here I'm plotting the volume trapped divided by the basal width cubed, so we've removed that dominant effect and we can look at some secondary effects that control pile volume. And one of them is the slope. So this is the slope relative to the angle of repose. So 0 is right at the angle of repose, and here the volume of the piles becomes quite large. And in fact, if we were at slopes just less than the angle of repose, sediment would be stable everywhere, and that would be a soil-mantled landscape. So as we push steeper and steeper, we see the volume is reduced as the slope increases. Okay, so what we can do with this now is that if we have some measure of vegetation density, which we could get, for example, from LIDAR or field surveys, here we have from LIDAR, we can use these measures of trapping capacity to assess how much transient sediment storage there might be stuck on hill slopes that are greater than the angle of repose, and therefore assess how much may be released if we burn them. And so what we've done here's LIDAR from the San Gabriel Mountains showing a small catchment, 500 meters. Everywhere that's less than 30 degrees, we attribute to being soil-mantled, and therefore the sediment is more or less stable after a burn. And that's these light colors, which just sort of line the ridge tops here. Everything else is steeper than 30 degrees. Areas that are steeper than about 50 degrees we attribute to bare bedrock. We both observe that there's few plants growing on these slopes, and also, as I've just shown you, the amount of sediment trapped behind plants at those slopes would be quite small because of the slope dependence. And so it's really between 30 and 50 degrees that we expect the dominant parts of the landscape to hold this fire-induced transient signal, and we map something like 2 to 8 centimeters of effective soil depth with the tan colors and greater than 8 in the red colors. And if you add this all up, it ends up being about equivalent of about 10 years of soil production that's transiently stored on these slopes that are steeper than the threshold slope. So we can plug these sort of numbers into that simple mass balance model and run different scenarios, and I'll just show a scenario here where this is time in years. We have a fire occurring every 35 years or so, which is characteristic of this area. And here I have the sediment transport capacity. So this is the total capacity of the plants to store sediment. So that after a fire, the plants burn, then they grow back, they stabilize in size, and they burn, they grow back, and they stabilize in size. This is the transport capacity, or the storage capacity, but it's not necessarily the total amount of sediment that's stored, because sediment is fed in with soil production. So there's different lines here for the sediment storage. High production rates that correspond to the San Gabriel Mountains, for example, this dark solid line, shows that the sediment volume trapped behind plants increases in time, then it flattens out when the plants are at capacity, then it is released when it burns. If you have lower soil production rates, for example, this thin line here, then the soil production might be low enough that the plants never reach capacity before the next fire. And so the result of all this is the bottom plot, which is the sediment yield coming off the bottom of the hill slope. And we see that we have basically the background soil production trickling out until we have a fire. Then we release this transient storage, which results in a large pulse. Then there's some buildup of these piles after the fire as the plants grow back, and then we have a large pulse again. And the pulse that we're getting again is something like 10 years or 10 times the background rate. And this is consistent with data that we have in these mountains, so that these mountains are a great sort of experimental lab because LA County catches most of the sediment that comes off the Front Range because these debris flows are hazardous to the communities that live right into the mouths of debris flow canyons. And if you look at this data in time since a fire, over about a 100-year record for about 100 different basins, we see that during the first year or two following fire, these dark symbols here, the sediment yield is about an order of magnitude or so higher than the background rate, which is similar to the measured soil production rate. So this model of transient storage and release from these steep hill slopes to explain this order of magnitude increase following fire. It also explains why most ravel occurs in the dry season immediately following fire and in the absence of rainfall. Simply because these slopes are steeper than the angle of repose, the sediment is gravitationally unstable. It doesn't need rainfall to slough into the channels. And this has been seen other places as well, for example, in Oregon. And it also explains why ravel fluxes are substantially higher on slopes that exceed the angle of repose. Okay, so to summarize this work on bedrock hill slopes, again, we've tried to use a number of different tools to get at this problem, including modern observations theory, landscape observations, and laboratory data. And we find that sediment transport on steep rocky hill slopes is different than on soil-mantled landscapes and may be controlled by vegetation dams and sediment release following wildfire. And sediment response to fire depends on the vegetation storage capacity and may be inherently supply limited. And I'd like to emphasize the supply limited part because it's possible, for example, in Southern California, there's predictions with global warming that we'll have fires more frequently in these landscapes, and therefore you might expect an enhanced sedimentation problem from the mountains. But that might not be true in these landscapes if the soil flux is supply limited, rather than on a soil-mantled landscape where there may be plenty of soil to come off the hill slopes. Okay, so we've taken some ideas from soil-mantled landscapes and tried to push them into bedrock landscapes and evaluate them. We're going to do the same thing now moving into channels and look at incipient motion of sediment in gravel bed rivers and push them into steep channels and ask whether things hold the same there. So the current theory for initiation of sediment transport, most of you know, but just so we're all on the same page, usually follows the Shields number, which was developed by, well, something like it was developed by Shields in the 30s. And it's simply a ratio of the stress, the bed stress of the flow on sediment divided by the weight of grains. So you might expect that big grains require more force to move and small grains require less force. So you take the ratio of these two and you might expect this number to be a constant when sediment first moves. And indeed, if you're looking at large enough particles that Reynolds number effects aren't important, which correspond to gravel bed rivers and coarser, this constant seems to hold out and is generally used in our community for sediment transport modeling. Something like 0.045. So several workers have wondered whether this critical Shields number should be constant in steep mountain streams. So the concepts have really been developed for lower sloping gravel bed rivers, and as we push into steep mountain streams, there's a number of effects that seem like they could play a role, including grain emergence, particles sticking out of the flow, changes into the turbulent structure of the flow due to this very large flow depths that are small compared to the roughness scale, form drag, interlocking of particles, and possibly that these big boulders and things in steep channels aren't moved by fluvial processes at all, but that they're dominated by movement from debris flows. And these are different effects that we want to, again, dig into and try to test with a number of different tools. And so I'm going to talk about a data compilation, some theory, flume experiments, and field work. So first, the data compilation. As of 2008, this is all of the critical Shields number data that was available as a function of slope. There's been several good studies since then that aren't included in this plot. And it's color-coded here based on flume data and field data. And you can see the assumed constant of about 0.045, and you can also see that although the data has a lot of scatter, it seems to suggest that the critical Shields number increases with increasing channel slope. And this in itself is quite remarkable, because if anything, one might expect that the critical Shields number should decrease with increasing slope. This effectively says, the data suggests that it requires more bed stress to move grains on steeper slopes. And because gravity is acting on grains, pulling them in the downstream direction to a greater degree on steeper slopes, you might very well expect the opposite trend. But the data suggest otherwise. So what's going on? Well, we decided to try to approach this problem by building on a force balance model for incipient motion developed by Weiberg and Smith in '87. And this is the exact same terms that they've used, so there's nothing new here, looking at force of lift, force of buoyancy, force of drag, force of gravity, balancing these on the grain. What is new is we tried to plug in, the best we could, a number of these different effects, including grain emergence, changes in the turbulent structure of the flow, into this force balance model to see, as we go to steeper slopes, whether these effects can explain the heightened Shields number as a function of slope. And again, I'm just going to skip right to the results here. And here's the critical Shields number for incipient motion. Here's the bed slope. So above this line, grains move. Below the line, they're stable. The data set I showed you before. And again, the theory of Weiberg and Smith, for example, shows the intuitive result that you'd expect, that the critical Shields number is more or less constant until you get to very steep slopes. Then it decreases because of this gravitational effect, which doesn't seem to match the data very well. If you play with a number of these different effects, you can get a model that produces a critical Shields number that increases with slope. And the dominant effects that we found to reproduce this include changes in the structure of turbulence in the flow that essentially change because the grain scale or the roughness scale gets to be comparable or larger than the flow depth. And so that changes things from our classic log law rules. And also grain emergence at these very steep slopes. Part of the particles can stick out of the flow, and that essentially renders them less buoyant than they otherwise would be. But going through this exercise that's been out now for some years, we noticed that there's a real lack of data for slopes greater than about 8 degrees, and this is something we've been trying to tackle recently. So the way we've chosen to do this is to do experiments. So why experiments? Again, measuring boulders moving in slopes that are greater than 8 degrees can be quite hazardous and also difficult to catch at the right time. So we can simulate rare events and also isolate variables. And so we're using 2 centimeter well-sorted gravel, natural gravel. We incrementally increase the discharge and capture the bed load and use a reference transport rate to infer the critical Shields number. Of the different variables that I put up before that could be affecting the critical Shields number, we've eliminated a couple of these in these experiments. So we've eliminated form drag as a variable because we're using planar beds for all different slopes. And we've also eliminated interlocking of grains as a variable because we have a loose bed with smooth walls, and we also have no flume width to grain size effect, which we've tested. And what you see in the upper right is a movie of conditions pretty close to the incipient motion at a slope of about 17 degrees. So there's water moving through the gravel matrix, and then there's a thin bit of overland flow moving over the top, and you should be able to see some grains rolling around. I can't really see it. So let me skip right to the results here. So the critical Shields number versus bed angle. This is the same, all these gray symbols are the same data set that I've been showing you before, but they're all squeezed into the left-hand side of this plot because I've switched from a linear scale or a log scale in the previous plots with bed angle to a linear scale here for you to better highlight the steep slopes that we're currently working on. So the 8 degrees, which was the limit more or less of previous data sets, is right here, all those other data sets. And again, you can see our new data is these red points, and they seem to follow this the model that includes this grain emergence and changes in the turbulence quite nicely. There is also, for those of you familiar with this model, there's a knob for form drag, and in here the data seem to fit well with the model with no form drag, as we might expect because, again, we have planar beds here where form drag should be small. Oh, and so I should just emphasize that, so at slopes up to about 20 degrees here, which are very steep channels, but nonetheless, we have critical Shields numbers of the order of about 0.2 or so. This is about a factor of 5 bigger than the the normal Shields number that we use. So sediment seems to require, say, a factor of 5 greater shear stresses than we would expect from just extrapolating the lowland information. So of course there's a number of effects that we don't have in these flume experiments, and so it's important to do field work. We've been doing field monitoring of modern observations in Northern California over the past 3 or 4 years. We're looking at, again, at very steep slopes where there is this absence of data. So here's just an example of a slope at 4 degrees and a slope at 20 degrees, a channel at 20 degrees. And here we're painting grains and going back after different storm events and seeing when these grains move. We have stage height recorders so we can reconstruct the flow conditions during those times. And one of probably the dominant effect that we found from this field data that's not in the experiments is the effect of the grain size relative to the roughness scale. So in our experiments, all the bed was uniform gravel, so the grain size of interest was the same size as the roughness scale. But in the field, they can vary quite a bit as the bed is organized into sediment-sized patches, and this tends to be the dominant effect controlling the critical Shields number. And Weiberg and Smith's model in 1987 also includes this effect there. The data points, which are all shown in these two things, though, do seem to be shifted from the Weiberg and Smith model, which is the solid line, and are more consistent with this model that includes the dashed line, that includes some of these slope-dependent effects. So again, in the field, we see a higher critical Shields number than we would normally expect in these steep channels. And partially this can be explained by grain emergence and the changes in wake turbulence, but we also, for the field case here, needed to include a form drag correction that includes, which is about a factor of 2 to explain the heightened Shields numbers in the field. Okay, so the last mechanism that I put on the list there was debris flows, and it's possible that many of these steep channels could be dominated by sediment transport by debris flows rather than by fluvial processes. And this is something we're just starting to try to get a handle on. Here's this glorious video from the Illgraben, and there's been a suggestion in the literature for some time that debris flows may dominate in these steep channels. For example, Stock et al. 2005 note that as you plot slope versus drainage area of a channel, and when there is fluvial incision, you'd expect a power law scaling, so a straight line, and that this power law scaling seems to break down when you go to steeper and steeper slopes. And of course, many other people have observed this now, and this break in slope seems to be something like 22 degrees in the Stock et al. Paper, here 34 degrees in this DiBiase recent paper. And the suggestion is that at very steep slopes, this may be the signature of a handoff to debris flow incision rather than fluvial incision. And if that's true, we wonder, well, this should also be a handoff to debris flow transport since we need to move boulders to erode the bedrock bed. So is this also a signature of a transition to boulder transport by debris flows? So we're going back to the flume with the simple 1D flume and going, here's again the movie I showed before of incipient motion at 17 degrees. And if we go steeper and steeper, we would expect to run into mass failure at some point. And so on the right is incipient motion of grains at 30 degrees. And you can see that the dynamics are quite different there. And this would be what we would call a mass failure, concentrated mass failure versus dilute incipient motion by fluvial processes. I point out that these are both incipient motion, so in both cases there's water flowing through the gravel matrix. In both cases there's some amount of overland flow. And in both cases this is the first time that we've seen grain motion. So at the very steep slopes we get mass failure even with overland flow before we get any fluvial transport. So going back to our plot that I showed before of the Shields number versus slope, here were the red points where we observed fluvial transport, and now I've added these green triangles, which are cases of incipient motion by mass failure. And here you see that the Shields number decreases as slope increases, and allow you to sort of bracket out domains of no motion from bedload transport to mass failure. So for example, the steepest, the most stable beds seem to be slopes of about 22 degrees, which are stable up to Shields numbers of about 0.2. If you go steeper than that, you run into the mass failure zone, and if you go less steep, you can get into bedload transport. There's also, for any slopes greater than 22 degrees, for our gravel parameters that we have here, friction angles, etc., which this is probably dependent on, any slopes greater than 22 degrees, you go from no motion right into mass failure without any bed load transport. So it means that at slopes that steep, you might not expect to see any fluvial transport if grains are going to move from in-channel processes. They're going to move by mass failure. And as we go to lower slopes, the interesting thing about this plot is that it suggests that you may go from a zone of no motion to bed load transport, and if Shields numbers are high enough, you could transition into a mass failure regime. The debris flow data seem to line up nicely with this theory by Takahashi, 1978, which is essentially an infinite slope stability theory with an added driving stress term for overland flow. So this transitional slope, where we'd say initial motion occurs by fluvial processes versus debris flows, seems similar to the slope area scale break that we've noticed in the field of up in the 20s of degrees. And again, this shift to mass failure, potential shift to mass failure, note we have no data points up here to test this yet, but we're working on this end of the curve here. But if extrapolating the Takahashi model is right, it suggests that at very large Shields numbers, for example, corresponding to large bed stresses or fine bed sediment, we could shift into the debris flow regime. And I want to come back to the fire problem because it's possible that this is the connection that we're looking for in these steep landscapes between fires and debris flows. So after a fire in the dry season, we have ravel loading these channels because of the loss of vegetation dams. This ravel is typically much finer sand and fine gravel size, still non-cohesive sediment that lines the channels that are otherwise made of cobbles and boulders. This bed sediment size perturbation would make the Shields numbers, even for a normal 2-year event, much larger than they would typically be, and perhaps make channels that are typically fluvial behave more like debris flows due to mass failure. Of course, there's debris flows that come off the Hillslopes too, and I've neglected all that, but it's possible that in-channel failure could be the dominant process here. Okay, so the summary of the steep channel bit is that, again, looking at different tools that probe different length and time scales, from theory to landscape measurements to field measurements in laboratory, we find that grain stability is enhanced in steep mountain channels compared to moderate gradient channels due to wake turbulence and particle emergence, and that debris flows can form from in-channel failure above a critical slope, and this slope is sensitive to floods and bed sediment size perturbations. Okay, so we've concluded the steep part of the talk, and now I'm going to still talk about alluvial rivers, but try to push down to very low slopes where we move next to the ocean and look at effects of that boundary condition. So coastal river dynamics, backwater erosion, and delta size. So again, starting with what we know and typically use for lowland channels away from the ocean, it's very typical to use this normal flow approximation, or the approximation of steady and uniform flow, which basically results in a water surface slope that's parallel to the bed slope, and that bed stress can be adequately represented by the product of depth and slope. This approximation is made in most fluvial deltaic morphodynamic models because it simplifies things incredibly. It seems to bear out for most channels away from the coastline. And it also is an approximation that's made in experiments, whether it's intended or not, simply because most experiments that we do have slopes that are steeper than their counterparts in nature, resulting in larger fruit numbers that minimize or eliminate the backwater effects that I'll talk about. The important part here is that deposition in rivers where we make this normal flow approximation is dominated or can be caused by various things like delta progradation, subsidence, or sediment supply. And these are the typical things we talk about when we're talking about erosion and deposition in alluvial rivers, the sort of balance between water and sediment, the tipping the scales. As we approach the ocean, things can be different, though. So here's the same cartoon where we might expect normal flow in the upstream part, but as we get closer and closer to the ocean, the water surface must eventually match with sea level at some point, and this boundary condition exerts a strong control on the river processes upstream. And so This causes, for example, at low flow, with my blue line here, where the ocean level can effectively drown the lower parts of rivers, creating deeper flow as you move downstream, which decelerates the flow and creates a zone of deposition. But high flows are equally likely to be perturbed by this boundary condition. For example, at very high flows, the water surface, again being pinned by sea level, can be forced to draw down, creating thinning flow as we move downstream, acceleration, and erosion. And in fact, if this idea is right, it suggests that the lower parts of rivers, especially right at the river mouths, can be the fastest moving flow and the most erosive zones that there are, which is quite counterintuitive, I think, as most of us, or at least I, had thought that rivers near their mouths are typically sluggish and would be zones of deposition. So again, these dynamics here of erosion and deposition in this backwater zone are driven not by delta progradation, subsidence, or changes in the balance of water and sediment supply, but are driven because the water surface and bed surface are not parallel, resulting in these spatial accelerations and decelerations. Another point here that bears out that I didn't mention on the last slide was that typically we think of larger discharges being accommodated by rising stage height. So as we go out to a river, and if it's in flood, the water level goes up, and that's typically what does happen. But in these backwater zones, because the water surface and the water slope and the bed slope are not the same, much of the higher discharge can be accommodated by tilting the water surface rather than changing depth. And this is what was shown by Nitrauer et al. 2012, that the water surface slope can increase dramatically in response to floods, as I've shown between the difference of these blue and red lines. So again, we weren't the first ones to think of this idea. It's been around for some time, and Lane in 1957 made a cartoon that's very similar to the one that I had, and again argued that low flow results in backwater and deposition, and high flow, sort of counterintuitively, results in this drawdown and scour. And we want to dig more into the implications of erosion at river mouths by this mechanism, and so we're going to test this with a numerical model, some flume experiments, comparison to the Mississippi River, and then finally a couple applications. I'm going to talk about avulsion and how these backwater dynamics may be determining the size of deltas, as well as application of this as a paleohydraulic tool on Mars. So the numerical model is similar to one that many have used. There's a quasi-1D model with conservation of fluid mass and momentum. These go in to make a backwater equation, which talks to bed load transport, which evolves the bed topography affects the flow, and so we have a morphodynamic simulation. What's key here, though, is that we're modeling both the river and the offshore river plume, since if there was no shoreline here, we wouldn't see the boundary conditions that we have. So the river plume dynamics are strongly controlled by the elevation of the ocean here, which in turn set the boundary condition for the river. So there's a river and river plume part of this model. We've also done flume experiments where the setup is very similar to the numerical model. There's a river section with an ocean section where the river plume is allowed to spread laterally that effectively holds the boundary condition at the river mouth very near sea level. In these experiments, again, to see these dynamics really unfold, it's important to oscillate between low flows and high flows. If we ran a bank-full condition time and time again, we wouldn't see this dynamic change from a concave up to a convex up water surface, as I've shown in the cartoon. And so these experiments oscillate between high flows and low flow discharges. They're all subcritical, Froude numbers less than 1/2, which is important to see these effects as well. There's a constant bed slope for all cases, which is important. Or in other words, the sediment supply at the upstream end of the flume is set to be at the transport capacity. Again, this is important because we could certainly force aggradation or degradation in the flume by changing the balance of water and sediment. We're not changing the balance of water and sediment for the high flows and low flows. They have the right amount of ingredients to maintain a constant slope so that the erosion and degradation that we see are purely a result of the backwater effects. Again, why the experiments? Well, here we can speed the pace of landscape dynamics and isolate variables. So I don't have time to go through these results exhaustively, but I want to show you just some snapshots of what we get out of the experiments. This is after we've run a low flow case for some period of time, a low flow discharge, and you're looking at the riverbed here. Measured is the squiggly line, the model is the dashed line. It's squiggly because there's bed forms. This is distance along the river as a function of elevation. The river is upstream and the river plume is downstream, and the division here is 0. So the plume starts spreading about right here, and you're looking at deposition of the delta as a result of plume spreading offshore with the river section upstream and the water surface here. And I'll just step through as we have this low flow equilibrium bed. We turn on a high flow, which should produce the same bed slope, but should scour as a result of these backwater effects. So after 3 minutes, we see a significant scour, 13 minutes, and finally 103 minutes, where we've eroded the bed, maintaining the same slope, but eroded the bed some 4 or 5 centimeters in these experiments. And it's one of the interesting and unexpected things that came out of these experiments that the numerical model does not produce is an area of enhanced scour offshore. So this very deep hole out here is offshore in the spreading plume where we would expect things to be depositional. Just to highlight that in plan view, here's the low flow bed elevation. The colors are topography, so the reds are high and the blue are low. Here's after a low flow case, and this is a picture of the spreading plume spreading quite widely. And in the offshore zone, the spreading plume tends to make levees on the sides, very similar to experiments by Rowland et al., for example. But as we oscillate between low flows and high flows, we see that the high flows are a really important part of the story because they can scour the offshore channel and actually lead to more channelization of the plume than by just running a single discharge alone. So here the plume is more channelized, and here's the scour hole that's deeper, in fact, than anything up in the river section. And we're not quite sure why the scour hole is forming yet, but we do observe that oscillating between low flows that build levees and high flows that scour channels together can lead to channelization offshore much more efficiently than doing a single discharge. Okay, so now that we have some faith in this model, I want to apply it to the Mississippi River where the backwater effects are quite pronounced. They extend some 500 kilometers over the lower river, which takes us from head of passes here, which will be x equals 0 for us, all the way up to the border of the state of Mississippi at x equals 500 kilometers. So much of the lower river are dominated by these effects. And this is also a zone where Nitrauer et al. Have shown beautifully this zone of erosion in the lower 150 to 200 kilometers of the river, where the river is cutting down into consolidated sediment or quote-unquote rock. And it's really this observations that first inspired us to think about what could be causing incision in this lowermost part of a very low-sloping, sluggish river that led us to these drawdown ideas. So skipping to the results here, so this is the long profile of the Mississippi River through that reach. 0 is at head of the passes near the river mouth, or the first set of major bifurcations, which to us is effectively the river mouth. As we go upstream to x equals 500 kilometers, that's the extent of the backwater length. This is the riverbed topography measured from the Army Corps of Engineers. All the symbols are data points measured by the Army Corps of Engineers, and the dashed lines here are the model outputs. And I'm just showing 3 different discharges that occurred historically on the Mississippi River. Low flow event in blue, sort of bank full 2-year recurrence interval flood in green, and a high flow 27-year recurrence interval in red. And you can see that the low flow does what you'd expect. In the blue line, there's deepening of flow as you go downstream. This results in deceleration of the flow velocity as you go downstream, and this results in deposition. And at the high flow, the water surface is pulled down to the river mouth, resulting in acceleration of flow as we move downstream, which bears out in the model but also in the data here of 3 stations that have been measured for these events. And this produces erosion in the model in the lower 100, 150 kilometers or so. Again, you can see very nicely in this model and in the data points that the water surface elevations at the river mouth vary very little in comparison to the water surface elevations further upstream, which creates this tilting of the water surface. So again, the floods are accommodated here mostly by tilting the water surface, not so much by stage height increasing. So if we take this model and we run it over and over again for thousands of years with different low discharges and high discharges to try to understand how the river profile would adjust to these multiple events, many interesting things fall out, but one of them that I want to highlight here is that there's a prediction for where the river might avulse. And this is a channel fill time scale I plot here, which is which is the characteristic depth of the channel divided by its local aggradation rate. This is a time scale proposed by Morrig et al. And later by Jeromek and Morrig to indicate the time scale of avulsions in a river. So a river basically avulses when it fills up about one channel depth. That's what it says. And we can plot this channel fill time scale, a local measure of it, as a function of distance from the river mouth. Again, here's the river mouth. Here's the backwater length at about 500 kilometers and further upstream. And interestingly, if we run just a constant discharge in this model, a constant bankfall discharge, we get this dashed line, which is no real prediction of where this time scale may be a minimum. Where this time scale is a minimum is where we'd expect avulsion to be more likely. But because of the backwater effects, we get a minimum in this time scale, and that minimum scales with the backwater length. It's not exactly the backwater length in this model, but it scales with the backwater length. And this happens because during high flow events, you're essentially scouring out very near the river mouth, and so that makes avulsions less likely there. And further upstream, during low flow events, you're depositing at the backwater length, and that makes avulsions more likely there. Did I say less likely at the river mouth, more likely upstream? So you get this minimum in the channel fill time that's somewhere within the backwater length, which suggests that these backwater dynamics, although important at the flood level that I've been talking about before, could play out to change the locus of avulsion on the river. Another part that figures into this avulsion story, again, is that the stage height variations are very small near the river mouth, as I made the point earlier, and this again could lead to less likelihood of river avulsing near the river mouth. So this seems to bear out somewhat in looking at field data from other deltas. So this is an idea that was proposed by Jeromek in 2009, where he noted that the dominant scale of deltas, what really sets the size of deltas, is this avulsion length scale, since deltas are fans that are built by avulsing about a common node. So if you go and measure the dominant length of deltas, you get an estimate of the avulsion length scale. And if you plot this versus the backwater length, you find a very nice correlation for a number of deltas, suggesting that these backwater dynamics could in fact be setting the size of deltas. Okay, so the last application I want to mention on this, and I didn't get much time, well, I didn't get any time to talk about planets, and this is a significant part of the work that we're doing, and so I just wanted to mention it in one slide as it relates to this backwater work. But Mars, for example, has a tremendous amount of geomorphology, and geomorphology is really at the forefront of interpreting the history of that planet. And here's a feature that Roman has been working on, which we interpret to be a delta with different lobes. This is actually preserved in inverted relief, as there's been several billion years of aeolian deflation on Mars, so these are now ridges of likely sand bodies that are sticking up. And why this backwater length is such a cool hydraulic tool is because it's very easy to measure the size of these lobes, which then gives you an estimate of this backwater length scale. And if you have the backwater length scale, you have now the relationship between slope and depth of the flow. And if you can estimate one of these other parameters, you can say a lot about a place like Mars. And the way in this study we're estimating depth from looking at the thickness of cap rock here, which we take to be a scale of the channel bodies, which Morrig et al. And others have argued to be the scale of the river depth. If we map out this cap rock thickness, which the blue is the bottom of the cap rock, the red is the top, we see, for example, a slope break, which we interpret to be a top set, foreset break in these deposits. But nonetheless, getting the depth and the slope, or getting the depth and the backwater length, we can calculate the slope. And calculating the slope for a low-sloping channel on Mars is very difficult with existing data and with a couple billion years of modification. But if we have this from this paleohydraulic tool, we can now calculate a whole host of parameters, including the flow velocity, discharge, sediment size, sediment flux, and depositional time. And so I think that this backwater scaling will be a very promising paleohydraulic tool. Okay, so the summary of the work on coastal rivers here, again, trying to use a wide range of observations that span length and time, from landscape observations to laboratory experiments. And we find that coastal rivers are coupled to their offshore plumes and ultimately sea level. And this coupling may cause scour near river mouths, filter source-to-sink sediment flux, promote offshore channelization, and potentially determine the size of deltas. So now I have three conclusions and then a parting note. So again, the theme here is to try to push existing theories to these extreme environments of very steep and very low slopes, And we found that on steep rocky hill slopes, sediment transport is different than on soil-mantled landscapes and may be controlled by vegetation dams and sediment release following wildfire, and that this wildfire-induced sediment yield may be inherently supply limited, which I think could bear out to give much different predictions of, for example, climate change responses than for soil-mantled landscapes. In steep channels, we find that grain stability is enhanced in steep mountain channels compared to moderate gradient channels, primarily due to the effects of wake turbulence and particle emergence, and that debris flows can form from in-channel failure above a critical slope, and this slope is sensitive to floods and bed sediment size perturbations. And finally, backwater dynamics can filter source to sink sediment flux, promote offshore channelization, and determine the size of deltas. And just to come back to the beginning of the talk, I think that there is a very exciting future in landscape dynamics, and there's a number of different bullet points I could have put up here of reasons why I think it's exciting, and I picked three that I touched on to some degree in this talk. The one that I've talked about the most is this new knowledge, and I really think that our community is bridging the scale gap between what we can observe in terms of dynamics and what we know is going on over longer term. And we're doing this by careful field measurements of modern observations, landscape kinematics, as well as using laboratory experiments and numerical models. And I think it's very exciting that our field is at the state where we're developing new theories and testing existing theories in new environments. I put up a sustainability here as something that Luna Leopold certainly championed, and I say now more than ever, I think we need to understand Earth's surface response to perturbations such as fires and floods that I've talked about in this talk. And finally, planets. As Bob Sharp was one of the early investigators of geomorphology on Mars, and the process-form linkage that we all often strive for in our work really provides the primary controls on planet surface evolution on a number of planets like Mars. And this really puts geomorphology at the frontier of exploration in science. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah.
No?
We're close to the end of the session, but we should introduce a few questions, please. And will the session, I heard from the next session that they have a little bit of flexibility, which is supposed to start at 11:35. So we will allow a couple of questions here and then go on. I'll try to pick them out. I'm in the spotlight. Do we have any questions?
Quick questions?
Perfect lecture, then. Okay.
I can't see anything. I'm blinded. So the question is, if there's a broader grain size distribution, would there be a difference in the transition of mass failure because there's less flow through the bed? I'm not sure. We're investigating this. The theory, the Takahashi theory, doesn't have any permeability in it. I had suspected that permeability could be important, and through conversations with someone who knows more about it than I do, Dick Iverson, he said he didn't think so. So there's the width to grain size ratio is large enough in these experiments, and the walls are smooth, that I don't suspect that there's any jamming. And changing the width to grain size ratio doesn't change the results. We've done two different cases. But in the field, the walls aren't smooth, and the width to grain size ratio can be smaller, so that there is jamming. So I'm not trying to say that jamming's not an important effect, but if we eliminate that variable from these experiments which we've done, these other effects seem to explain a lot of the trend.
One more?
So you showed how the shear stress for coastal gravel, and when you change the slope, has a dependence, and you know that on the value. How do you now extrapolate that and put it back into the shields diagram? So showing that now, or we keep it constant.
I don't understand the question, but
You're showing that there is a correlation of the incision of motion as a function of the slope of your system.
yep.
Then that slope and the critical conditions for the sailor to reach that slope is associated with gravels and boulders. So we go back to shear stress and dimensional grain size. How that information can we put it back to the shields diagram?
I'm still not sure I get it, but so the plots I was showing you were all Shields number, not shear stress, I think.
Well, shields number as a function of slope, no, but the ones we use most is shields number as a function of grain size. But you're showing that the effect of slope is important there, so we should change the shields diagram. Instead of using slope, can we calculate those and put it back into a grain size?
Yeah, so the grain size effect I think I understand your question now. So the grain size effect that you typically plot the critical Shields number versus Reynolds number, which is a grain size effect. And it's been argued by many that if the Reynolds numbers are large enough, that the grain size effect or the Reynolds number effect no longer plays a role. So for gravel or coarser sizes, you can ignore the Reynolds number effects. And so that's the part of the data that I've shown you. I haven't shown you any sand bed critical Shields numbers as a function of slope because there the Reynolds number is an effect, and then I'd have to have 3 axes, and I don't know how to do that. So the intuition from previous work and ideas from turbulence is that once it's turbulent, once the wakes behind grains are turbulent, it shouldn't really matter how turbulent they are. You should get the same answer, and there's not a Reynolds number criteria. Whether that actually bears out or not, I'm not sure, but we haven't tested over a large range of Reynolds numbers yet, although we are going that direction.
I want to thank Mike for a very insightful, invigorating lecture, very clear lecture. I just want to conclude this session with a couple of announcements. One is that in the beginning of the year, 2 things or in the first part of the year, 2 things related to our focus group are going to occur. We're going to have fellow nominations. There was a year without fellow nominations. So if any of you think that we have worthy candidates for AGU fellowship, please begin thinking about that. And the other will be our next generation of annual awards. And so begin thinking about that as well. There are a number of issues that we want to be considering as a group over the next year or so that if any of you have any thoughts and comments about, I'd certainly be happy to hear things like the structure of our meeting and scheduling of it, outreach to students and young researchers, outreach to our other organizations, both in the U.S. and foreign, that deal with geomorphology. How can we increase our integration with science in those other formats or focuses? And then ideas for meetings and for field conferences, things like Chapman conferences and the like. So if you have things like that that you would like to have our group maybe endorse or promote, please contact us. So we're now going to be transitioning to the next section, which is Introduction to the Future of Human Landscape Systems. Is it Andrew doing the beginning of that? You here?